Today's video is another tutorial, and today we're going to be looking at the Artisan Pro Panel. Roll the intro. For those of you that have never heard of this plugin, it was created by Joel. Joel, how do you pronounce your surname?
Hi Ben, it's pronounced Tjintjelaar. Joel Tjintjelaar.
Okay, so I haven't got really good at CGI. That was really Joel. He needs no introduction. He created this genre of photography. If you haven't heard of Joel, for any of you guys watching this, if I convince you that this plugin is for you, Joel has given us a discount code. I'll put that in the description below. And yes, I do get a percentage of that. But that's not why I'm making this video. There aren't enough tutorials, well there aren't any tutorials other than Joel's on this plugin. So I thought it was about time somebody else made a tutorial on this other than Joel. The reason that I call this video an introduction is because the panel does so many things we aren't aware of. Joel obviously knows them because he's created the panel. However, he's only made a handful of tutorials and it doesn't cover everything that this plugin can do. My intention is, if there's a lot of interest in this video, I would like to create a video on every single feature in the Artisan Pro Panel. Alright, let's jump onto the computer here and I'll give you a quick overview of the panel. So once you've installed the software, if you can't automatically find it, go to Windows, Extension and BW Artisan Pro. I'll drag that across here so that you can see all of the features. So what we're looking at here, these are essentially shortcuts for a lot of the activities that you'll be doing. So the first tab on the panel is Pro Tools. I'm not going to go into this in much detail. So if you go into the channels, you'll see here, this image has already got 15 selections. That's nothing to do with luminosity masks. But if I click on Lights Plus here, it's going to generate luminosity masks for this image. These 8 luminosity masks are based upon the different light levels in this image. And that was just Lights Plus. There are half luminosity masks. If I click on Lights Plus under the half luminosity masks, it would generate another 8 based upon the intermediate light levels. And then I'll just click on minus and then it will remove those luminosity masks. More about that in a future video. The next tab you're going to see here is the black and white conversion. This is essentially replicating all of the things that I would do in Silver Efex Pro. Joel recommends using neutral. This is a good starting base point. Here you can see neutral. Let me show you a few others whilst we're in this panel. That's low key, high key, dramatic, fine art, subtle. Okay, I think we've seen enough. We'll move on. The next tab is global adjustments. Quite simply, this affects all of the tonal values whatever you select here. So I'll show you later on in my workflow how I use this to darken the skies. The next tab is advanced adjustments. So what I'll do is I'll give you a rudimentary example. I'm just going to select a part of the sky here. What this part of the panel allows you to do is concentrate on darkening the darks and lightening the light areas. So as an extreme example, I'll hit D4. What that's going to do is give you maximum darkness on the already darker parts of the image. You can see here that has darkened the darks considerably. It's had a slight effect on the highlights. So the idea of this is so that you start to create the contrast using the default settings, and then once you've got that difference between the darks and the highlights, you then move on to the Smart Linear strict version, which then starts to leave the highlights alone when you're hitting the darks, and vice versa. More about this section once Joel has told me all of his secrets. Next up, I'm going to show you the micro zone adjustments. This is a really clever tool. What you'll need to have open is your info tab, because this tells you as your cursor goes around what the red, green and blue tonal values are. Just say I wanted to selectively manipulate this part of the reflection of the City Hall. 45, 50, yeah, around the 40s, 50s. So what you do is you go to this. These are all the different zones of light. So according to this, these tones here fit into the light shadows. So you click on that and you activate it. You'll get this message. You just click stop. I've not even read it. I don't even know what it says. But don't worry about that. And then you make a rudimentary selection around this here. Like so. Yes, this panicked me the first time I saw Joel doing this as well. But don't worry. You'll see. Because this zone is selected, you can start to manipulate the image and it will only concentrate on certain tones. Just as an extreme example, I'll select strong darken and I'm going to keep on clicking on this, and you'll see what it should do is it should leave all of the highlights and the midtones and everything else alone. So if I deselect that selection, I've done 1, 2, 3, 4 different moves now. If I switch off those previous 3 so that you can see the overall effect, even though my selection was rudimentary, you can see it's just concentrating on certain tones. Likewise, if I wanted to carry on and start to increase the brightness of the glass around it, so I'm going to deactivate the previous shadows, and then I'm going to activate the light midtones. So I'm going to make another rudimentary selection around here, and I'm just creating contrast between this here and the reflections up here. So if I say strong lighten, another strong lighten, and another one. So if I deselect that now and I switch off all of the previous changes, what you'll see is using these micro zone adjustments, concentrating on the shadows and the mid highlights here, you can see that I've created contrast, a bit of depth. So that's the whole purpose of this section. The next section, which is called creating depth, this is where you're going to spend the majority of your time creating fine art images for architecture. Okay, so let me give you an example. I'll just load up the selection of the building here. Traditionally, I would be using the gradient tool to blend between layers. Because the sun is coming from the left hand side, I'm going to create some shadows coming in from the right. Drop down menu, I want the shadows to go from right to left, and as an example, I'll just hit D3. There you go. This is an automated action for what we used to do in Photoshop. Right, I'll come back to this in a lot more detail when I show you the workflow. And finally, we've got some toning. Now, in the past, I've not really added any color toning to my images, but this is where you add very, very subtle color toning to your images.
Let me walk you through my workflow on this one particular image. It was taken in Moore, London. The building in the background is City Hall. And if you're interested, I didn't create a single selection on this image. I outsourced it to the pro image editors. More of that in a future video. I'm going to have to ask you to do me a favor now. I'm going to have to ask you to forget everything that I told you to do in my previous videos. The workflow using the Artisan Pro Panel is completely different to how I've been doing it for years now. If you've watched any of my previous videos, you'll know that I use multiple layers and I drag out the shadows and the midtones and the highlights from various different photographs to create the final image. The Artisan Pro Panel does away with all of that. You're using one layer. That'll make some of you nervous because now you only have one layer and you've got limited ability to go back. And that is why in your new workflow, you need to be saving your Photoshop files at regular intervals with a new name. That is what Joel does, and that is what he recommends you do.
So let me give you a quick demonstration of how the workflow used in this panel is completely different. I'll start by creating a neutral black and white conversion, and you'll see with every single click of this panel, it creates a duplicate layer. And the problem with this, your file size just keeps on increasing. Just ignore what's happening to the image here, but every time I click on one of these tools, it creates a duplicate layer, and the image that started off as 120 meg is now up to 878 meg. So if I was confident with those moves that I'd made, then I need to be merging the layers down. So if you follow Joel's advice, right click, merge down, and then that will keep your file size under control. So ideally, you're going to be left with the original raw file and your latest black and white image layer. Okay, so enough about the tools. I'll show you how I've used them to create these images. The first image that I created was this London city line. I've only used a handful of the tools on the panel to create this. The second one that I've created is this one here. Then I'll show you how I edited this to the final image which you see here. Okay, first step, we're going to create a black and white conversion. Joel recommends using neutral because we're not trying to create any contrast at this stage. We just need a base image. So next, click on Global Adjustments. We're going to load our sky. Low key. Crank that up to 100%. Load the selection for the sky again. And then you're going to darken this to taste. As an example, I've done low key 100% twice.
and that's almost where I want it to be. So we'll start with that. So now that you've done the sky, you're going to move on to the creating depth feature. This is where I spent the majority of my time on this image. Next thing we want to do, let's, for example, we see the handrail coming in from the left. If I want to darken that to create some depth and draw your eye to the City Hall. Before I create the depth on this, let me show you what the creating depth tool does. I'm just going to create a rudimentary rectangle on this relatively flat tone. In the creating depth tool, small, medium and large. Small represents 25% from here to here. Medium is 50%, so that will be from here to here, and large is 75%, which will go from here to here. There is no 100% because that would just be darkening. And then this is the intensity of the shadows or the lights that you'll be adding. So I'll give you an extreme example. So I'm going to give you maximum darkness at 25%, which is the small. So if I click on D4, you can see here it's having the most amount of effect in the first 25% and then just a gradual feathered effect here. Okay, so that's the medium effect, so that's giving you quite an impact upon the first 50% and then a gradual feather. You can see here now the graduation is reaching all the way to the end now, and that is how this creating depth tool works. If you watched my video where I edited some buildings in Glasgow, you would remember that I started with the dark exposure and added the highlights. Good photography practice is to be shooting to the right, so the raw file is not going to be dark. And because you're only working with one file here, when I'm using the creating depth tool, I'm adding shadows. I didn't add any highlights at all. So let's talk about the restore function. Just say I didn't want the shadows to come all the way to the end, then you can use a restore function. And you need to restore from the opposite direction from where the shadows came from. And you need to play about with this, but if you hit medium restore from the right hand side, keep an eye on this here, there you go. So I'll show you that again. So we can do a small restore. You may not be able to see this, but it's very subtle. Yeah, it's very subtle. Okay, let's apply this to the image and I'll load the selection, which was mask 6. Okay, now the light is coming from this direction. You've got to have a vision before you start manipulating the image. I want this to be my focal point. The light is coming from this direction, but I also want to control the shadows and the light on this so that I can draw the eye into the building at the end. My vision for this image is to create some darkness, bring the brightness of all of these buildings down a lot. Because the sunlight is coming from this direction, this is probably going to be the highest contrast point here where the sky meets the glass. Then this is all going to be darker in this corner, lighter along the top of the handrail. This is going to be darkened, and I'm going to create a slight pool of light here. Okay, so with that in mind, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep it from left to right, and then I'm going to start off with a large D3. And then I'm going to have a medium dark 2, and then I'm going to restore from the top. Yeah, and then what I'm going to attempt to do is bottom to top. I'm going to add some shadows from the bottom. There you go. You can see here how I've manipulated it to draw your eye in. Now, I've just quickly done this. I'm not trying to replicate the image that I've already edited. And you have to work into these images a lot. But I'm just demonstrating the tools and how they work here. Okay, let's have a go at creating some depth on the City Hall, which is my main focal point. What I essentially want to do is I need to darken the right hand side of this image because the light is coming from the left. Okay, and then maybe a D2. But the problem I can see already is that I've lost the highlights that were on the right hand side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a small restore from the right. There you go, what a difference the restore made. Let's work on the left hand side here. So I need to retain that highlight because I need that to be where people are looking. I think I still need to darken the sky a bit more, but I'm going to just create a difference between these two parts of the building. So I think what I'll do is I'll have a diagonal gradient coming in from the bottom right hand corner. There you go, I think that's about right. So you can see here, if I were to undo the last couple of goes, there you go, like it's starting to create depth and definition between this part of the building and that part of the building. This is already looking good, and I'm just using this as an example for this tutorial. From this point, you're just going to have to work into the image, trying to get to your vision, using the creating depth tool, adding shadows, highlights wherever necessary. There's one other interesting feature in the creating depth, which is special effects. So if we were wanting to just create a pool of light on this part of the building, you can just create a rudimentary oval like this. Hit L2, for example. And then if you hit Control T so that you can manipulate it, I can just chuck that around there like that. It's obviously a quick and dirty way of showing you the tool, but you can see here I've created a light source on the building that didn't exist. Likewise, if I wanted a big pool of light on this staircase here, there you go, and you could just take down the opacity of it, or you could use blending modes. So that's the special effects tool. And finally, we've got the color toning section of the panel. All of these are very, very subtle. So if I hit kind of blue, blink and you'll miss it. Did you see it? It's very subtle. You can see, but it works.
Just the slightest color tone seems to just work on some images. I don't think it's for everyone, and I don't think it works on every single image, but this part of the panel where you just add color tone, I have been using it.
Providing that you use the color toning very subtly and you don't crank everything up to 100, you can see now this has got a blue tone to it. But where it started off at 50%, do you even notice that this has got a blue tone to it anymore? Very subtle. I think subtlety is the key when adding color toning. So that's the color toning. You've got options. Try them out, see what works best for you. So after quite a lot of manipulation, this is the final edit that I came up with. You can see it's got a slight color tone to it. I've darkened all of the edges. I've got a retained highlight to the stairs. This is the highest contrast point, the edge of the building where it meets the dark sky. I've darkened the buildings in the background. I didn't use Silver Effects Pro once. I didn't use any of the tools in Photoshop. I simply used the panel to create this entire image. Let's compare my old workflow to how I'm using the panel. So to do the same task, I want to bring in some shadows from the left hand side on this handrail. This is how I used to do it. So I've created multiple layers. Here's the original, then I've got some shadows, and then I've got some highlights. I add a layer mask, I load the selection, and then I use the gradient tool to paint in the shadows. And you can see what I've painted here by holding down Alt and hitting that. You can see that's what I've painted in. And the only flexibility that I have in terms of this is where I start and finish this drag represents the gradient softness between the two. And you can also change the opacity. That does not give you anywhere near the amount of flexibility as using all of these. The gradient element of this aside, the only tones that I can drag into this are dictated by the images that I have. So I can only bring in as much shadows as I have in the shadow layer. I can only bring in the highlights that I have in the highlights layer. This allows me to completely override that, and I've got complete control.
The workflow using the panel is just little bits at a time. Everything that you do is just subtle, 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 and you build up the image. The old workflow, when you've got multiple layers, it's quite punchy. As an experiment to myself, the first image that I edited using the Artisan Pro Panel was a London city line, which I'll put up now. Then I tried to recreate that image using my older working methods, using multiple layers and layer masks and gradients, and I couldn't. The end result using the panel is just so much more subtle and refined, and it's a bit more grown up looking. I don't know how to describe it, but the image looks like a Joel image. We all know that Joel knows what he's doing. My other workflow, I think it gets you punchier looking images, which may be more successful for online. If you're being a true artist, you won't care what the general public think of your images. You'll take the advice of people that are experts in that field. If I wanted to create a punchy, high contrast image, then maybe I could revert back to my previous workflow, but that's not where I want to be. I'm looking at my old images now thinking,
they look a bit clunky. So that is why I'm making this tutorial, because I think more people should be using it. I know a lot of people already have it, and because there is a lack of tutorials out there, like most software, if there's nobody there to hold your hand, people will just say, I'll just stick to what I know best, and they continue with their existing workflow. I personally am going to be using the panel for all of my fine art images moving forward, so I'm sure making this video is going to spark a whole load of questions, so fill up the comments below. I'm happy to help out where I can. Thanks to Joel for sorting out that discount code. Thank you guys for watching. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.